I'm Margaret McKay. Welcome to the session. We're just going to wait a moment because I know there are a couple of people who are still trying to connect their audio, and then we will get started. All right. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. It's a delight to be here and to be here with such a wonderful panel. I think you're in for a real treat today. My name's Margaret McKay, and of course, we are all here for the panel discussion on strategies for maintaining trust while doing good science, addressing challenges in research using social media data. A couple of sort of administrative things before we get started today. You will all know you're being recorded. You also likely have noticed that this is the web platform, the webcast platform for Zoom, so your cameras remain closed. There are two forms of communication in which you can engage during this session. We do have, and we're really hoping that you will have questions for our panelists, and you can use the Q&A function for that. There is a chat function as well. If you want to ask a question of the panelists, we ask that you use the Q&A function. The chat function, however, the panelists do have access, but may not necessarily be monitoring it because they have to be talking. But it's useful for discussions among individuals and just sort of general communication. With respect to the Q&A, if you see a question you like, or it's very similar to a question you want to ask, we would ask that you please upvote the existing question rather than repeating it. This makes it much easier for the good folks who are handling the back end to identify which questions to bring to the front, the ones that have been upvoted, as opposed to having to try to figure out where questions are sort of focusing around a similar idea. So I think that is pretty much it for the administrative notes. I am going to just fiddle around here for a moment and share my screen. Then we will get started formally. Just bear with me. Not exactly my happy place. Okay, there we are. With any luck, I can control these slides too. All right, so I have welcomed you. You know why you're here. You know who I am. And now I just have to figure out how to advance my slides. I apologize. I'm working with 3 screens and my computer only thinks I have 2, so things get complex sometimes. Here we are. So I want to start today's session by acknowledging that panelists and participants today are connecting from many diverse locations and also work, play, live, and grow on unceded, shared, current, and traditional territories of Indigenous peoples. The National Research Council's headquarters and my office today are located on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Speaking personally, my formative years were spent primarily on the traditional lands of the Attawandarong neutral people and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. I would not be here today if it were not for my time on those lands and the lessons that I learned there. We recognize our privilege in being present on these lands, and we pay respect to the peoples who were here long before us. It is our responsibility in the spirit of reconciliation to improve our understanding of and relationships with local Indigenous communities and cultures. And may these lands and their peoples inform the work we do with our heads, hearts, and hands as we continue to collaborate and advance reconciliation. So it is my pleasure today to introduce your panel. They will have a few minutes to give you more information on their background, so I will not read you their bios at this time. You registered, so you obviously at some point found the webpage on this event. You can also find their full bios there. Suffice it to say that we have here 4 eminently qualified individuals to discuss these issues, and I think it'll be a fascinating discussion. From left to right, based on what's on my screen and not actually the speaking order, we have Dr. Ignacio Cofone from the Faculty of Law at McGill, Ms. Samantha David from Ingenium, Dr. Diana Inkpen of the University of Ottawa, and Vance Lockton of the Office of Information and Privacy Commissioner of Ontario. They each bring a unique and very valuable perspective to this discussion, and I hope that each of you, as we move into the questions and answers, will also bring your unique perspectives and questions for this group of individuals. It'd be so much more effective if my slide had advanced when it was supposed to. There we go. So why are we here today? This is a very complex area. I personally believe it affects almost every individual, even those not in research, but it certainly affects those engaged in research. So one purpose is just to enhance an understanding of the complexities and the nuances associated with these questions. Also, and quite obviously, as we have a significant Q&A aspect to this panel, we want to stimulate discussion regarding ways to respect individual and community rights and expectations, while permitting society to benefit from the social and scientific advances enabled through access to large-scale social media data analysis. This is not a black or white question. It's not a question of should we or shouldn't we do research. It's a question of how do we, what research, you know, how do we respect individuals' interests in not being included in that? Things like that I will leave to the panel to dig into. And then, you know, the third sort of purpose of today's session is really to encourage people to pay close attention to privacy agreements. Oh, I can't spell, sorry, potential implications of different choices and approaches. So here we are. The panelists will give you a lot more detail on this, but I did want to spell out a couple of things to watch and a couple of things to ponder on as you're hearing what they have to say. You know, this is a very wide issue. We may wind up only being able to really dig into a couple of aspects of it, but there are questions around the type of data that's being used. Even within social media, as you know, there's a lot of different types. The way in which it's being used. Is it being used for the purpose for which it was shared? Is it being used for other purposes? Is it being used for population level information, individual level information, that kind of thing? The types of access. Is it an approved API if they signed a contract with the same social media platform that the user signed a contract to? Did the user understand what they were signing? Another question, right? The goals of the research, commercial, non-commercial, things like that. What kind of organization is conducting the research? And is it a profit motive? Is it an indirect profit motive? Or is it a non-commercializable purpose? These are all the kinds of issues that bounce around in this space. So with that, I am going to turn this over to our first panelist, Dr. Diana Inkpen of the University of Ottawa, and she will tell us a little bit about the activities and role of a researcher working with social media data. Diana, over to you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for inviting me in this panel. I'm a professor in computer science, School of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science at University of Ottawa, it's Faculty of Engineering, and I had got my PhD at University of Toronto. My work is computer science, so I look at natural language processing, machine learning. Maybe the next slide would help. So mostly I do research in artificial intelligence, but natural language processing. So I look at social media a lot from the point of view of the text that's typed. We can do multimedia, we can load text and images and other video and other media and speech. I do a lot of work on machine learning as applied to text data. I put here, just for information, a book that I wrote with a co-author on natural language processing for social media, because it's a survey book where we look at what kind of applications researchers already did based on social media text analysis, and includes discussion of health applications, financial application, predicting if stocks goes up and down, predicting voting intentions. There are a lot of papers on that. Maybe based on Twitter data or other social media, to see what people like, how they might vote. And after the election, they check if the predictions from social media correlate with what the election results were. And not only for parties, but for candidates, for issues, are people pro this issue or against. Media has a lot of commentaries to news, a lot of social media that's after the media publications are their opinions and so on. A lot of application on disaster response, how to which areas, how to prioritize resources, how to offer help. User modeling is probably directly of interest to today's discussion, and other applications. And we also have a chapter on data collection, how to collect data from social media, how to annotate, how to do evaluation based on this. And I do work with any kind of text, social media text, medical text, legal text, but I'm trying to focus now on social media text because here is how today's topic, how should we be careful when we collect data for this kind of research. Next slide, please. So just to give you a few examples of the work I've done with my students. Looking at developing algorithms, computer science, machine learning algorithms for detecting opinions based on social media texts. Emotions, is a user happy, sad, angry? If the user said, we can provide some happy music, or I don't know, what kind of data we use, and how do we proceed about our work. And a lot of work we did on detecting signs of depression, not put in a diagnosis because we cannot do that, but if there is a sign that the user might need assistance from a medical professional, and even suicide ideation, because unfortunately there were many cases of social media when social media users encourage students to commit suicide. Unfortunately, there are many real cases like that. So mostly we use public data. Twitter is very popular in kind of a research we do in natural language processing because it's public data. Forum data is also public. So we couldn't even collect data that's not public, but we do have to be careful how we use it and what kind of labeling we do for this data. Are the labels sensitive, like depression and suicide ideation? We always get ethics approval from the university's board, and that is good for us because even if it takes a while to do the application, at least we know that we thought about what issues could arise, and the ethics board also had their own understanding and approval. And mostly the problem is, what is the end goal? What do you want to do with that data? Are you going to do something nice and useful? And because if you are a company, you are not going to have an ethics board. So there have been cases of companies who did things that maybe the public didn't quite like with their data. Definitely our ethics board would say you cannot monitor any user's life. And so we always use past data about users, and we don't know who the users are. We are anonymized. But if you have the user ID, assume you could go and find who the user is, but we don't do that. But anyway, so how do we collect data? Usually through the Twitter API or some other API, at least because we respect the agreement with that platform and the data to be. But why do we need ethics approval, in fact? Because the data might not have, it was produced, people share data. Why? Friends on Facebook, to find information on forums, to share their personal experiences to help others. But what we do research on the data. So this is called secondary use of data. So ethics approval for secondary use of data is needed, even if it's public data. Maybe when the users sign up on Twitter and forum, they agree to that. Maybe not, depends on what was the user agreement of that platform. And as Margaret said, did they understand what they are signing or not? Because we often accept the user agreement to speed up registration. So anyway, two more things I want to point out. The data we collect is usually could be imbalanced if the data is about people, which we could talk about here, social media users. Do we have data for all genders, male, female, others, for all age groups, for all ethnic groups, for all minorities? Usually it's very hard to do that. And even if we do, it will be less for many minorities. So algorithms tend to pick bias in data. So what do? There are some approaches we look in computer science to debias. Can you debias the data? That's a bit difficult, or unless you really undersample the other classes, majority class, meaning throw away data for the classes for which you have more data to keep a balance, but then you end up with little data. So anyway, changing the data is usually difficult. Other approaches to use the algorithms that are more careful and don't pick up so much imbalance. And the other approach would be to post-process. Let's say you train your algorithms, they might have some bias, you run some filters after. So these are issues we study in computer science. And my last slide before my 5 minutes are up. in the research we do, we look at each text, and maybe we don't even know where the text comes from. So message level, we could look at user level, put together all the messages from the same user and try to do some inference about the user. Where is the user located based on how they use language? Let's say type of English is specific to Canada, one to US, one to New Zealand. But for example, what is the gender? Is this blog written by a male or a female? And there is success in 80–90% of predicting who wrote this text based on kind of author signatures. Some of this profile information is declared. So we use that as training data to be able to learn how to predict this kind of characteristics. And then we could apply it to new users that don't declare it. We also did a little work on population level. If we want to predict the depression level for Canadian population, then we had to have enough data for each province and territory and for all age groups and our ethnic groups and so on. And we did have a kind of calibrated sample. And then let's say we work on data from 2015 because there was Statistics Canada data for the same year and wanted to see if our prediction, I don't know, 7% depression population level was the same with what Statistics Canada did. In their survey was not for the whole population also, but it was for a phone-based interview sample. So yeah, message, user, population level, there are different things to take into account, but in general, minority groups we don't have much data about them, so we don't want to, we can give, we have to be careful how to be fair against. So anyway, maybe I'll stop here and, continue the rest during the discussion period. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Diana. Sorry, I wasn't rushing you there. I was just trying to figure
out. No, I didn't watch the time, but thank you.
All right. Our next panelist to introduce themselves is Mr. Vance Lockton of the Office of the Information and Privacy Commissioner. Over to you, Vance.
Hi all. So yeah, I'm Vance. I'm currently with the IPC Ontario. Spent a bunch of time with the Federal Privacy Commissioner's Office as well. So I'm kind of coming to this from the perspective of the regulator. And I think in my initial remarks, what I want to do is set a bit of the regulatory landscape. So Canada tends to have a very sectoral approach to privacy regulation. You can kind of see on the screen how what it looks like in Ontario. Private sector is covered by the Personal Information Protection Electronic Documents Act, or PIPEDA. If we're getting into public sector, then we're talking provincial organizations are covered by FIPA, the Freedom of Information Privacy Protection Act. Municipal organizations are covered by MFIPA. If you're in the health sector, they're covered by PHIPA. And then when we're talking about things like not for the profit sector or employees or political parties, they'll often actually kind of fall through the cracks of those. So it can be kind of tricky sometimes to figure out where exactly folks lie as far as what will apply to them. Universities will tend to fall under Freedom FIPA, the Public Sector Act. Research data tends to be exempted from FIPA. So broadly speaking, it's not going to be covered. So where I kind of want to focus my initial remarks, because of the nature of our discussion here, is going to be on PIPEDA and how social media networks are able to allow collection of personal information for research. It's not actually obvious. So there's odd interpretations of privacy law sometimes. Arguably, if a researcher is able to get access to particularly get access to significant numbers or amounts of social media data, that will be considered a disclosure by the social media network to the researcher. So under what authority are they able to do that? Well, there are certain, PIPEDA is generally a consent-based law. C27, which is the potential replacement for PIPEDA, is largely consent-based. There's nuances there, but let's start thinking about there are a number of exceptions to consent. So there is an exception for publicly available information. This idea that organizations could collect, this is more a collection piece, but organizations could collect information that is deemed publicly available. However, publicly available information is defined by a particular regulation, and a particularly old regulation. And it would be fairly clear that social media data is almost certainly not going to be considered publicly available under the definitions that PIPEDA uses. So that exception is kind of out. There is a statistics, study, and research exception to consent under PIPEDA as well. It allows for user disclosure of information for statistical study or research purposes if it's impracticable to obtain consent, and the organization informs the privacy commissioner in advance before the information is disclosed or used. I can tell you, so granted, I haven't been with the federal office for a couple of years now, but to my knowledge, no notification has ever been provided by any organization under the statistics, study, or research provisions of PIPEDA. So in theory, no organization is relying on that exception to consent. That exception would also be included under C-27. Again, it's easy to argue that that's simply not being used. So if there's no applicable exception to consent, then we're getting into, so have individuals actually consented then to their information being disclosed to researchers by organizations. So that again will often be something that's kind of worked into a privacy disclosure. There'll be something that says, information may be user disclosed for research purposes. But I'll just kind of say I'm not. It hasn't been litigated, but I'll say it's unclear whether that simple disclosure is always going to be sufficient to meet the valid consent requirements under PIPEDA. So a fairly recent amendment to PIPEDA suggested that made the change saying, I'm just going to read it because it's on my other screen here, saying that consent is only valid if it's reasonable to expect that an individual to whom the organization's activities are directed would understand the nature, purpose, and consequences of the collection, use, or disclosure of personal information to which they are consenting. So somebody simply clicking on an I agree box, are they going to really understand what kind of research might be possible based on the data that they are posting publicly? I don't think it's always going to be clear, especially given the nature of certain research. We've had this litigated in certain in internal uses of data. So we've seen the privacy commissioner speak very negatively about certain, we'll say, live experiments that Facebook and others have done. So just the idea of like emotional manipulation is kind of like, experiments of what happens if we show more positive messages than negative messages. Do people get happier? Do they get sadder? What have? So the idea that that's kind of covered and people would understand that that's a thing that's going to happen with their information is very questionable. So again, I think there's interesting questions about how social media networks are disclosing information to individuals. And the last thing I'll kind of mention is that if you as a researcher aren't using like an API, and you're just actually kind of going through the social media network and collecting data yourself through some kind of scraping tool or something like that. First of all, that may be against the terms and conditions that some social media networks put out there. But there's also kind of ongoing discussions about whether social media networks are actually in breach of their security requirements if they don't take enough steps to prevent scraping from happening. There's been a lot of discussions with LinkedIn in particular about whether they've taken sufficient steps to prevent data scraping of their site. So I kind of leaving that up there as an open question as a regulator of like, it's not always clear to me, I'll say, how this kind of study of social media data, which is a fairly common thing to happen, is actually happening under the auspices of law. And so that's why I kind of want to pass it over to Ignacio to kind of say, how could this happen under the auspices of law in the future?
Thanks very much, Vance. And with that, we will move over to Ignacio. So over to you.
Thank you, and I'm really happy that Vance spoke just before me, because I mean it's both great and it's a problem, because Vance, you said a lot of what I was thinking about saying also. So rather than telling you about the law and how it's enforced, which is really helpful, I wanted to say a bit, building on what Vance was explaining about the direction where the law could go. So I think it's really important to acknowledge, both in terms of corporate data collection, processing, and use, but also in terms of research based on social media data and on big data research, that consent, which is the paradigmatic way to protect subjects from research, from the potential harms of research, isn't working the way we want it to work. So we took consent, which is this concept mainly from medical research, to allow people to protect themselves from the side effects that different forms of research may have. But in current, more complicated data environments, this doesn't work as well for a lot of reasons, and I will quickly go through 6 of them. One reason why it doesn't work very well is because it's really difficult for us to understand the consequences of whatever we agree to in big data information processing, both for companies and for research. And if we cannot predict the consequence of what we agree to, then our consent doesn't protect us as effectively as we sometimes assume it to. Another one is that the extent to which there are actual free choices that are made is questionable, depending on what platform we're talking about, depending on what type of data. There are not always meaningful alternatives to consent that would be a requirement for validity of consent in any other area of the law. Another reason is that de-identified data, which is to a large extent the data used for this kind of research, has a number of exceptions in privacy law. And while entities like the Privacy Commissioner have repeatedly said that de-identified data, sometimes deceivingly called anonymous data, is also personal data, because it also has risks that are attached to people, both in terms of risk of re-identification and in terms of group data that comes from that data that can be attributed later on to members of those groups. That's not always the interpretation that other legal actors take. So consent is often not very effective at protecting those forms of de-identified data. Another reason is that most harms that exist in the information economy and most harms that exist from the social media data that people may use come not from disclosed individual data points, but rather from inferences, like the mood that people are in, that Facebook can infer based on posts and likes, is an inference. So while regulators like the Privacy Commissioner correctly explain that inferences are also personal data because they imply the same risks, inferences are not covered by consent provisions in which we say that we agree to disclose that little piece of data because they're assembled later and we have no control over them. And that's where all the harm is, in the inferences, not in the disclosed piece of data. And lastly, the reason why consent is not very helpful is that data is what we call relational. So every time any of us discloses any information, we also disclose information about others, often without meaning it. And that that information is information that we literally disclose about others, or information that we allow companies to infer about others and to infer about groups. This goes from the simplest case of sharing, like if I upload a picture of my group of friends to Instagram, in which Instagram has my consent but doesn't have their consent, to more complicated cases in which I could send a DNA sample to 23andMe, and that allows the company to infer lots of information about my relatives and lots of information about people that share parts of my genetic data that are not necessarily my relatives, have things in common with me. And so I think it's helpful to take those things into account when doing research based on the sources of data that companies collect, because it means that if we care about the subjects of our research being protected, we cannot rely on this very traditional way of protecting them, and rather we could move to ethical principles that are more effective. Now, it would be desirable for the law to move to those ethical principles and not just stay anchored in consent like Canada's current law and proposed law do. But even absent that, we could individually, when we do research based on these data, move to those more ethical principles. So instead of asking whether consent was issued by the individuals whose data we use, because that's not very protective, we could ask things like, am I de-identifying the data as well as I can? Am I collecting more data that I really need to do this project, or could I collect fewer data and then still achieve the aims that I'm looking to achieve with this project? Do I have privacy principles in mind from very early on when I'm deciding the different stages of the process? Is the cybersecurity good enough? Could the cybersecurity be better? And those standards versus rules like consent would allow us to use data to do research in a way that is more ethical, that protects people better, and that may even be in line with future changes of the law later on. And I think I'm close to running out of time, so I'm going to stop there and leave it to the actual experts on doing research, and I'm happy to pick up on any of these during the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Ignacio. So now we will move to Samantha David of Ingenium, sorry, who will introduce herself and give us some additional perspectives on this. After Samantha speaks, we're going to have some questions. So please, if you haven't already, start putting your questions in the Q&A. Over to you, Samantha.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much. So I'm Sam David. As mentioned, I'm the Director of Tradia Relationships and Initiatives for Ingenium, which helps to support our national museums on science and innovation. But, you know, like I also have like a secondary role as a human research ethics committee member and as somebody who's been working in the Indigenous science space for a long time. So, you know, I'm going to give you probably the world's fastest TED Talk when it comes to Indigenous sovereignty principles. But, you know, like I think some really good points have been brought up so far in terms of, you know, thinking about terms and conditions and whether or not that's actually, you know, real proof of consent. You know, there's a fantastic art installation by somebody named Dima Yarovinsky, who actually printed out all of these terms and conditions across the social media sites. And, you know, the example of Instagram, for instance, you know, it's over 17,000 words were counted out, and it would take you approximately the same length as this panel to be able to read through the entire thing if you had, you know, like that level of comprehension in English. So, you know, thinking about the ways in which informed consent is provided is definitely going to be a big part of my talk. And especially, you know, recognizing that social media spaces don't have the same rigor of, you know, sort of legislation and regulation in the ethics space is because of the fact that, you know, like these are very new platforms, and, you know, thinking about these emerging data types and this data ecosystem is going to, you know, fundamentally offer a lot of ambiguity when it comes to ethical considerations, which is why it's important for us to kind of rely on what frameworks we can and interpreting those frameworks in a way that ultimately makes sure that we're not harming communities any further than has already happened in the research space. So you can move it to the next slide there. So the first principle I'm going to run over very quickly with you guys is from the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So this one is particularly important because this is a declaration that is being implemented across federal institutions in Canada. So the notion of free, prior, and informed consent, which is very deeply embedded across decision-making and across research considerations for Indigenous peoples, is going to be something that is going to have to be realized across, the Tri-Council Policy Statement, for instance, across human research ethics committees, across the ways in which we design policy that may impact Indigenous peoples. So the notion of free, prior, and informed consent came about as a result of decades of frustration when it came to things like extractive research practices, when it came to, non-transparent efforts to acquire consent from communities in the relation to particular projects. So, just a quick example is that, a company may be interested in extracting a particular natural resource in a First Nation community. So they would approach that community and use scientific engineers and terminology that wasn't known from that community. Whether or not they even had English as a first language was also not something that was considered, in order to obtain consent in kind of a dubious manner. And this is something that has been recognized as a problem throughout the entirety of the world, not just Canada. So free, prior, and informed consent came about as a means of trying to recognize the fact that, unless the participants and the decision makers are fully aware of the impacts of the type of research that's being done, and social media is a very good example of that as well. You can't genuinely call it true consent in like the aspect of a community willingly engaging in this type of practice or platform. So it's very important as we're thinking about this space that when it comes to vulnerable communities and especially Indigenous populations, informed consent is a right. It's not just something to sign off or check a box on, and it's something that within the sort of research ethics committee we're becoming extremely critical about, especially within federal science institutions. So next slide, please. So the second principle might be familiar to a few of you if you've been engaged sort of in the open data, open science space. This is one that again pertains quite closely to the social media sphere because of the fact that social media is something that is very publicly available and is very easily scraped and turned into these sort of interoperable data sets. Now, when the FAIR principles were developed, there was a parallel conversation that was happening with the Research Data Alliance talking about those principles around free, prior, and informed consent that I was talking about earlier, as well as other discourse in the sort of Indigenous science sphere when it came to thinking about data sovereignty and open data sets. And this is quite important because it developed what's called the CARE principles. And there are two aspects of this that I think are really important to this conversation. The third principle, responsibility, details quite a lot in terms of the notion of developing relationships with Indigenous communities and Indigenous experts in these particular areas to make sure that when we are having these conversations about consent, it's done in a way that's transparent, it's done in a way that builds trust, builds capacity as well, and is done in a respectful way. Indigenous communities have varying understandings of what consent is. Individualism is not necessarily something that's always seen as like a common idea within traditional teachings. So it's really important that we get a very good understanding of what it means when we're talking collective consent, when we're talking community consent, especially with research projects that may be looking at, targeting Indigenous community that may only have 60 members. So, the identifiability of the people, utilizing that social media data is going to be quite high. The other aspect of this as well was to ask about the ethics of these data sets. So does the data set itself potentially perpetuate harm or negative stereotypes about communities that are directly included in that? And as a result of that, is the secondary use of that data set following like the initial publication carry any risks in terms of harming those community relations? And there's plenty of examples I can give about like where this has kind of happened in different spaces. Health data has a lot of examples of this, even like, audio data, like the information from biographies, for instance, has also been utilized in this way. All right, you can move to the next slide now. So the last one, and again, like this is all of these could be their own sort of a research topic on their own. But the last one we'll touch upon today is ownership, control, access, and possession. So these principles are First Nation specific to Turtle Island, and these are the ones that really ask us about, what is the larger life cycle of research and how are communities actually involved as part of the process of developing this research from start to finish. So, ownership, control, access, and possession came about as a result of the abuse of Indigenous health data and the interpretations of that health data, and the frustrations, understandably, that communities felt in terms of the ways in which they didn't have access to their own health information, for instance. OCAP asks us to take a look at that larger ecosystem and ask the hard question, like, when we're designing these types of research projects and we're thinking about the ways we're utilizing social media data, are we doing this, about communities, without communities, or are we incorporating Indigenous principles throughout to ensure that we're taking a very meaningful long-term approach to the ways in which this could be potentially impacting communities? So, when we're thinking about this from the Canadian context, it's really important to recognize that, many vulnerable communities are talking about the ways in which social media data may potentially impact them and are very, very cognizant and painfully aware of the consequences of the misuse of information and data as well. Because of the fact that social media is a platform where we don't necessarily have those regulations yet, we need to be very cautious and very cognizant when we're entering these types of spaces, especially if we're going to be dealing with populations that have already had, historical harms brought to them because of the fact that, new technologies were utilized and, sort of interpreted in ways that didn't allow for those types of voices. Like, it's not an acceptable practice in Canada anymore. And, growing work within the federal institutions requires us to make sure that we build that relationship and that trust at the start before we even think about the ways in which we might be engaging with these types of ecosystems. All right, so that's it for me, but I can go on for sure.
Thank you very much, Sam. That was great. So we are now moving to the Q&A portion here, and I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen. Here we go. Okay. Okay. So we have a couple of questions to start, as just to allow you as audience participants
Good evening,
to.
everyone. Before I start, I look around this room
We seem to have
and
some
I see so many
background
friends,
happening here.
so many people I love and appreciate.
Okay,
And
I'd like to ask the first
family
question,
for a
and
long
we'll start
time.
out with Diana on this one, and others can build on it. So that question is, to what extent is it feasible for researchers using large-scale social media data to identify the features or privacy preferences of particular data subjects? For example, to permit the study or exclude specific groups. Diana, over to you.
I think I already touched a little bit, saying that yes, we could learn about users if we look at their messages, even as Ignacio said, that what they like, just giving likes and so on. So if you have good data and good algorithms, you can make predictions about users, but we always carefully test on past data. We never go live to try, because even if we detect anything, that we don't have authority to intervene. The main issue is to not have enough representation, enough data. And you need to if you want to have a study that is fair across groups, then you have to have representative data for any group. If you have a study for a specific group, then yes, you can collect only that data for that. I cannot comment on that kind of stuff. So maybe I'll leave it open to the other panelists.
Anyone else care to comment on this? All right. We can always circle back to it. It probably will tie into some of the other answers later. The next question, and I'll start with Vance on this one, and then others can chime in. But what does the data ecosystem look like in the context of research use of large social media data sets? And within this ecosystem, where should the responsibilities lie with respect to the recognition and protection of different types of rights and interests?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's I'm kind of going to take those a little bit backwards, and I think that's been a theme that we've been speaking to throughout the introduction. So Ignacio and Samantha both spoke to this. Is this idea of it certainly doesn't seem to be working. This idea of thinking only of two two players of social media, the social media company and the individual who is making particular posts. So that's when we're talking about data ecosystem. I think that's what I'm trying to get at, is this idea of when we're talking about studies, we do have to kind of think about the roles and responsibilities for that social media network, for the users, for the researchers, for research ethics boards, for regulators, for communities, to the extent that they're able to kind of operate as a group. Certainly, that's the case with Indigenous communities, but you can start to think. I was working with the Sidewalk Labs project that was proposed in Toronto, and one of the things we were considering, so I was kind of on the regulator side for that as well. One of the things we were kind of considering was, how could we work in this idea of community consent or community feedback on projects when there aren't necessarily natural representatives for a community that's affected. Sorry. So I guess that's where I'm trying to get this idea of like, I want to prompt the people on the call and the other presenters to think about how do we move beyond this idea of just simple individual consent when we're talking about how you make social media data available. I think it's just not a functional model, and not an appropriate model. Like the idea that individuals should have a sufficient level of understanding of academic research to kind of be able to make an educated decision about whether they want their data to be used in these wide array of studies. I mean, that is a huge burden to place on somebody who just wants to engage with friends and family and the public on social media. So I think that's, I'm not giving a particularly good answer. I'm just trying, almost like I'm expanding on the prompt for others to feed into, of like, where do we kind of go from here? Like, how do we move beyond that idea of the individual being largely responsible for deciding whether their data is can be used for a secondary purpose like research.
Thanks very much, Vance. Others who would like to chime in on this? Oh,
yeah, I mean, I certainly have some thoughts about this for sure, because it's such an interesting question, because like, again, it's predicated on the idea of whether or not users are aware that their information is being used for research in this way, right? Like, as I mentioned before, like these terms and conditions are prohibitively long and use the sort of like legalized language that isn't necessarily at the 6th grade level, which is the recommendation for plain language usage for public information, right? So when we're engaging in these types of spaces, like part of this is to as institutions, we need to make it very clear and very transparent, I think, as part of our science communications approach when information is being utilized for for social, when we're utilizing like social media data in these types of spaces, and to offer creative solutions in terms of consent and whether or not that consent is provided. Like as Diana had actually mentioned a little bit, like looking at Twitter IDs, for instance. If you're like scraping data and you have Twitter IDs, there's an opportunity there, I think, in terms of like developing like either an outreach or utilizing those sort of almost like those Survey Monkey type technologies to send out requests for consent, and sending out those sort of plain language summaries of what that information is being used for. Like one of like the biggest problems, I think, when it comes to social media data is the fact that folks don't know, period, that like their research is actually being utilized in this particular way. And the fact that we're also holding ourselves to the same standards as private sector, I think, is also like a big issue as well. if we're working in federal research spaces, if we are working, as a representative of a larger institution, we need to be very cognizant of the fact that public trust in those institutions will be negatively impacted by the ways in which we engage with social media data. So if we are not transparent from the start, that's a massive reputational liability risk for us as an organization when it comes to engaging in these types of spaces. So we need to make sure that we're doing that outreach and that communication in a way that, like, maybe a little bit aggressive, but ultimately is towards trying to increase those transparency conversations as much as possible. Even if we had reports looking at this specifically, I think would be a really interesting area of study.
Thanks very much, Sam. Diana, put your hand
Just
up.
to add to this, I was thinking if any kind of if a kind of blockchain technology could be used to, the user has control. Yes, it's public, I posted, I agree. But every time it will be used in a new study, I have to say, yes, I agree or no, or I could withdraw my consent. But it has to be done without too much burden on the user, because the user doesn't want to waste their time that way. So I'm not sure how could that work.
There's some interesting opportunities for, I think, centralization of policies or consistency among of policies. So I mean, it was interesting, as I was just doing prep work for this panel, I was looking at just research ethics boards, or university research ethics boards policies on social media, and come across things like, Queen's and Toronto Metropolitan University have literally the exact same policy. It's word for word the exact same policy. So there's interesting opportunities for standardization, or broader discussions with the public of kind of saying, what, the university community or the Canadian science policy community is trying to come together to create, this is what our policy is going to be, and you can engage with broad groups of the public to kind of say, okay, here's how we are going to engage. And we've consulted and we've had a lot of discussions with disparate communities about, here's how everybody's going to do this going forward. I think there's just interesting opportunities there as well.
Yeah, I also really, really like the idea actually of, this is going to be, this is going to have to be a conversation with those social media platforms, but, actually having some variation of a notification similar to a like or similar to a comment, where if somebody is going to be extracting your, your content for a social media study, giving you the opportunity to click yes or no to that study, and being given an opportunity to even see the abstract or something like that, I think would be a really interesting opportunity. We already have those notifications anyways, in terms of the functionality of these types of platforms. So having one where you can actually say, I consent to the study, or I want my information removed from the study, I think would be a really interesting feature. And that's not even touching upon the complications of, if a Facebook page or a Twitter account is private, is that information, not consented to when it's scraped for social media data? Can it be scraped for social media data? Who knows?
Thanks very much, Sam. Ignacio, did I see you unmute yourself up there?
Yeah, I was also going to chime in. I think those are really interesting considerations. I would even have a more radical departure. I would say individual consent is so difficult and so laborious to obtain. I mean, Diana was even talking about assembling a whole blockchain system, and we know that it has so little utility that I think we should stop bothering with it.
Yes.
And we should rather move to minimizing risk and minimizing harm through general principles. The thing with, we can devote a lot of effort to putting complete notifications, doing simple language, but there's also empirical research that shows that simple language policies only help to a limited extent. First of all, because people don't have the time to read very long notifications. And even if they do, it's really hard to predict the inferences that will happen from the little pieces of data that are collected from us. So especially as researchers taking the lead on more ethical data uses, it would be helpful to rather focus on, I think, Samantha, for example, you discussed group consent at one point, and group consent is more helpful because if you're engaging with a community rather than notifying each member of the community, you can have a conversation about what's a responsible data use here. What does this community think is a way that will keep everyone accountable to collect and use this data. Or if we're gathering social media data, we should let go of the distinction between public data and private data, because public data also produce harms, and rather see, are we amplifying the audience of this information that may be already public if we do this research? If we're amplifying it, are we doing it in a responsible way? What are the harms that we can accrue? And is there any way that we can do research while minimizing those risks, independently of whether those people would have clicked yes to potentially take over those risks without maybe fully understanding them?
Thanks very much. Other comments on this question before we move on? Okay. So I have a question in a moment for Sam, but just to the participants right now, as you know, you're on the Canadian Science Policy Conference. They are our hosts today, and we'd like to help them out a little bit by allowing them to collect a bit of demographic information, knowing who's logged in for this and where you're from. So if you wouldn't mind just completing the poll quickly here. In the meantime, I will read the next question, which will be going to Sam. So the question is, what are the key considerations involved in the use of social media data for research?
All right, absolutely. So, when you're planning out like the initial research design, there's a number of questions that I think are really important to ask about. Kind of getting back to Anastasia's point about like minimizing harm when it comes to this this type of work, because again, the ethical considerations with engaging with social media data are going to be very different depending on the types of data that you're going to be using and the types of questions that you're going to be asking about that. And like all of this is predicated on whatever types of knowledge system that you're using. So this could vary wildly depending on the researcher themselves and like the sort of disciplines that you're coming from. But we should be fundamentally asking, does this research target or impact a specific vulnerable community? What possible harms or benefits could come from my research? Or do I have someone from that community who can help to support that assessment? Like, is there someone I can actually reach out to ensure that my assessment accurately reflects those community interests if I'm not a member of that community myself? We should also ask, does the social media platform that you plan to collect information from allow for anonymity, and what sort of factors can be done in order to ensure that participant information is meaningfully protected within the data set? Because again, the type of data that you collect is going to produce very, very different results. If you're doing like, a case study analysis of Black Lives Matter movement, for instance, and you're using postings to provide, like feedback on that, like what's the level of anonymity that would be required there? And is that even possible if you're going to be using like, very specific qualitative content from those platforms? And, it's also a fair question to ask whether or not, depending on how specific and how targeted your research is, whether or not you want to contact community leaders about that project. And so, in most cases, that's not really going to be a problem. But, if you're going to be looking at, again, like a community that only has 60 people in it, and of those 60 people, there's like maybe 20 youth who would most likely use Twitter, that is not going to be an anonymous sample source. It's very easy to identify people from those types of research topics. So it's good to ask community members every now and again to see if it makes sense, to kind of further that study, or whether or not it may be too high risk for those individuals. The reality is that when we engage in the social media space, we need to do so in this very contextual fashion. The level of scrutiny at looking at demographic information, for instance, is going to be very different from if you're analyzing that post content quite deeply and looking at the language behind that. This is also impacted by the main subject of the study. So again, if you're going to be engaging in those activist networks or very vulnerable spaces, like, say for instance, you wanted to follow Me Too, which is a deep, follows some deeply traumatic content that is very distressing and potentially re-traumatizing for users to kind of rehash, what sort of ways in which can we ensure that we're mitigating harm when we're engaging in that content as part of that consent seeking process? It's also, again, like I can't emphasize this enough, but, we really need to recognize the fact that, terms and conditions does not equivocate consent. So, again, depending on your topic, it's really important that we do that additional legwork and build those additional relationships with communities to make sure that we are doing this in a good way. Like, social media is fantastic in the sense that, this ecosystem of data gives us a really good, very human look into things like movements in organizations, the way people move, the way people think. But it comes with massive risks when it comes to that informed consent that we've been talking about, the anonymity, and as well as the profiling aspect. Diana talked a little bit about the data bias, and that can have a very harming effect depending on how that data set is used. So especially if you want to work in like federal research spaces, we have obligations, I think, to hold ourselves to a much higher standard of care, because that's that's what the public expects of us as researchers. And, you know, like there's plenty of cases where this has gone horribly wrong. A really small one I'll kind of give is that, you know, there used to be like a massive movement to record a bunch of Indigenous data and oral histories because there was the expectation that these communities were disappearing. However, those communities didn't disappear. They've been around for many, many years, and they're still around today. But that data was then reused for artistic purposes. And, you know, there was one instance where a very famous opera has a particular song that was a funeral song from a nation. And the way the nation found out is that there happened to be somebody from the audience who was part of that listening in, and they found out that a funeral song was being used in a very mocking way. So, you know, that did not go over well. But like, this is exactly the types of data abuses that could absolutely happen in this area. And that was a very recent example. We're talking the last like 5-10 years, give or take. So it's important that we're very cognizant and aware of the potential risks that can come from the misuse of data. You know, it's also important that we take this care and demonstrate a culture of care as we're engaging in these spaces, just to ensure that this stuff doesn't happen again, or at the very least, we're proactive in making sure that this doesn't happen again. Like, risk mitigation is the key when it comes to any of this work.
Thanks very much, Sam. Others, thoughts, comments on this? Okay. We have a question from the audience, and I'll throw it open for individuals. You can probably see it there, but what are some of the ethical considerations of using social media content for research related to disinformation or misinformation, and possibly identifying individuals or groups of people who may be responsible for malicious acts? Sorry, Victor Lochte wanted to answer the question. So no, I think he's just, okay. I'm going to throw it open to the audience and, sorry, I'm going to throw it open to the panel. Please go ahead.
This one is fun because, again, if we're talking the distrust of research environments, generally the bodies who you know, like, again, like this, like, I'll admit this is a little bit of a stereotype, but generally these bodies are very distrustful of researchers when it comes to these types of spaces. So I mean, again, like, the transparency is always going to be key. You don't want to be ambiguous when you're working with potential groups that might be perpetuating misinformation, and you're gonna want to navigate those spaces very carefully as well, because, like, again, the other issue with social media is the volatility of some of these communities as well, right? So if you don't present yourself in a fully transparent way, in a way that you know, very clearly mitigates the, or, you know, like, mitigates the harm and emphasizes like what those harms and benefits are as part of those conversations, it could quickly turn sour, I think, depending on who it is that you're engaging with, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I would just kind of throw that harm consideration out there too, of again, not having a lot of experience with the research ethics boards myself. I just kind of say, it's like, you just have to go into it understanding, especially if you're trying to identify people responsible for malicious acts, acknowledging that such an identification is at least potentially, if not certainly, going to cause harm to one or more individuals. And so having that in the back of the mind when you're kind of presenting this research ethics piece is like again, we can't dissociate the fact that you know, harm will be caused by identifying potential bad actors, just because we disagree with their actions.
If I may,
Yes, please.
So the question is very interesting. So there are two aspects. One, identify misinformation or rumors. I've seen research work on doing that, and it's difficult topic to understand what is true and but there's some fact checking that could be done automatically or manually, and then messages or misinformation could be labeled and left it up to the user to decide, but it could be kind of at least a warning. Be careful, this could be misinformation. That would be helpful. So this is just but the second part of the question about specific users or groups with malicious intentions, if the flagging brought by an automatic system is wrong, could be not cause some bias, but what if the program misses some important, somebody plans to kill people, bomb, go to a school, and then the program doesn't flag it and the police doesn't check it. So we rather have flagging and the human in the loop check, is it maybe a real threat that we should further investigate to prevent a real criminal activity? So, technology can help, but it has to be taken, use it properly, and then manual confirmation would be needed. But yeah, unfortunately, there are cases that, yeah, any.
Go ahead.
I think that's a really good point. I mean, and maybe it even exceeds the misinformation question. And it's more general, the question of how you have humans in the loop and how you responsibly use algorithmic system to minimize these harms as we were discussing. And I think part of that conversation is reflecting about the harms of false positives and the harms of false negatives. Sometimes a false positive can be really, really harmful, or sometimes a false negative can be really, really harmful. If the flagging is to prevent a harmful act, then a false negative, so missing a harmful act is really bad. And false positives can be bad if that means that that the people are flagged as potentially dangerous when they're not. But if we can have a human in the loop in the system, then we can have systems that are calibrated to have more false positives and false negatives, and then a human checks for those false positives. The reverse, if we're in a situation where the false negatives are the harmful ones and not the false positives. And medical research is really good at this. So for example, algorithms that scan for tumors are calibrated to miss very few real tumors and falsely flag lots of things that are not tumors, because you cannot get it both ways. And then you have a human checking for those results. We could expand that logic into more forms of research that would allow us to reduce harms and doing it as responsibly as possible.
There's an interesting piece. So I mean, all kind of expanding beyond social media spheres for a moment too, but I think one of the considerations, especially when we're getting into identifying individuals, is this idea that the simple identification of somebody as spreading potentially spreading disinformation, misinformation, is a harm, or at least likely should be considered a harm. We've had it's something that our office gets into a lot with law enforcement. This idea of law enforcement kind of doing automated checks or facial recognition or things like that, and kind of saying, there's this idea that the facial recognition system will only identify you as a potential lead or a potential suspect, and so that's not really a harm, because we'll do it. But we kind of say, no, that actually should likely be considered a harm, because there are going to be additional consequences to that. So I guess my point is I think I would just want researchers to go down that road of thinking of, it's not just kind of saying, I could identify, like, if this person is identified as a source of disinformation, they may get, kicked off the social media network, and that's the harm. I think the harm, we have to take a step back and just say the harm kind of starts when they are identified as or potential harm anyway, starts when they are identified as, this source of this negative activity.
Yeah, and I mean, I think there's first of all, I still think it's a really valuable topic to talk about, but this is where we kind of get into the methodology side of things, right? So if you're looking at the migration of information and the migration of data, and it could be the migration of disinformation or misinformation, maybe there's other ways of doing that don't necessarily target people out. If you wanted to look at, for instance, algorithms and how they kind of pick out information and disinformation and cluster that to promote that within those communities, that could be a way way of like, taking a look at that phenomenon and that movement without necessarily harming those individuals as well, right? Like I think there's a very, very interesting area in terms of bias and AI and sort of like the development of computer coding that has been talked about a little bit, but it's not necessarily been explored, I think, to the extent that we really should be taking a look at that. Again, like, mentioning the fact that technologies do have biases and do have profiling issues as well, I think is quite an interesting field of work. I mean, like the idea that, facial recognition doesn't work on certain racialized faces because of the fact that, like there are individuals who are not involved as part of that coding process, and how that actually changes the engagement with that type of technology is super interesting. Or, even voice recognition, if you have a stutter, or if you're somebody from like a person with disabilities with a speech impediment, your ability to utilize that technology will be biased because of the fact that technology doesn't have those considerations in play. So, if you take a look at the ways in which those structures are created, I think would be a really interesting way to look at that sort of misinformation flow and how that sort of all connects together, right?
Thanks. Maybe I'll throw out there, I think various people have touched on it. I haven't heard it said explicitly, but to take this down a notch and into sort of the content moderation scheme. I mean, there is ample research out there to demonstrate, for example, that certain dialects which tend to be found within particular racial communities and genders are far more likely to have their posts automatically flagged as abusive, when in point of fact they're not. I guess I would ask, what is, from kind of a privacy and, won't say censorship per se, but from that sort of perspective, what are the considerations arising from that more day-to-day aspect of access, right? Anyone?
I mean, yes. Like, if you don't stop me, I'll like just talk this entire time. But yeah, I mean, like this is almost exactly the type of point that I'm making, right? Like, I think we should be critical about like algorithms and the ways in which they're interacting in these types of spaces, because again, if social media algorithms are actively profiling racialized communities or marginalized communities as part of that, how is that flagging system and reporting system working, right? And like, is there actually like a disproportion that we can like measure from a research perspective in terms of that flagging system? Or are we talking like, a very largely vocal community versus a very like non-vocal community as well, right? So it'd be really interesting to see like how these types of things kind of look like behind the scenes and why that actually occurs. And again, that could absolutely be because of the makeup of the organization itself. Like, again, if you don't have a diverse organization of coders who are working on these types of algorithms, you have a much higher propensity for developing like biased coding or AI generation than if you had like a very like heterogeneous sort of organization, right? So who are the faces behind the program, and how does that impact the ways in which that program decides to weed people out based off of like again the terms and condition violations, whatever those are, right? Because it is a very ambiguous space, and there's not a lot of people who understand that.
I'll throw out again. This is slightly extreme, but under PIPEDA right now, we have this overarching clause, this idea that organizations can only collect, use, and disclose personal information for purposes that reasonable person would consider appropriate under the circumstances. If C27, the replacement of PIPEDA, moves forward, that gets expanded slightly to the idea of use and disclose only in a manner and for purposes that a reasonable person would consider appropriate. So one of the interesting potential things here is that if you start having these content moderation software that are disproportionately harmful to particular groups, especially marginalized groups, I think an active privacy commissioner could kind of take the stance that it's like that would make it in violation of privacy law. Again, that's purely a hypothetical that I'll throw out there, but it's certainly something that's been kicked around, is this idea of particular disproportionate harms may impact that appropriate purposes test. So again, it would probably have to be intentional and or negligent to hit that kind of a level, but it's something that organizations would have to consider in like a moderation policy. We're kind of getting away from the research context a little bit, but like it's an interesting consideration, because maybe, to bring it back to the research context, if we're talking about, again, it covers disclosure. So if we're talking about maybe a disclosure for research that actually is causing harm to an individual, maybe that disclosure wasn't appropriate, and would fail that test regardless of whether consent actually happens. So that particular provision overrides any consent that happens. So again, just kind of kicking ideas around here, but there's a line that could be crossed that would just kind of say, what, no, that harm de facto kind of makes this purpose particular purpose inappropriate.
Thanks, Vance. And I think what I'd suggest now is we can continue on this kind of theme, but maybe I'll throw a couple of other considerations back that maybe pull it a little bit more tightly to what I think is predominantly the institutional research context that most of our audience here probably come from. We've mentioned on several occasions research ethics boards and the potential for them to play a role in this space. Of course, TCPS2 recently had some updates around data repositories. I would put out to the panelists, first of all, of course, the acknowledgement that only a fraction of research is actually covered by research ethics boards. But when we look at current research ethics boards processes, feel free to pick out the pieces of this question you like, but to what extent are current approaches, including the recent updates, appropriate and able to manage and address some of these questions? And then if anybody wants to get really granular, should social media data repositories be viewed as, or social media data be viewed as repositories under TCPS2, which I think would be a very, a very significant change in my view. With that, I'll turn it over to our panel.
Yeah, so just based off of my experience, it's going to vary wildly. Like, I'm not sure how many people are aware, but there's only like about, I want to say 7 research ethics boards for the federal government right now. Agriculture Canada is one of them, and that's the one that I'm on. But from my perspective, one of the things that I think is kind of important for this space is to actually have people with backgrounds in social science as part of this, because again, when you're dealing with human ethics and human behavior, that's really where social data really kind of sits. And what I find from some of the other ethics boards I've talked to is that's something that sometimes gets left out a lot of the time. So I think this, thinking about and discussing social media from that perspective, I think is really important when we're considering these types of things. If you had people with diverse backgrounds or knowledge of Indigenous data sovereignty principles, so for Agriculture Canada's human research ethics board, we put a lot of scrutiny behind our types of relationships and conversations, because that's something that directly impacts us from a lived experience perspective. So we actually have 2 members, myself and another member who are Indigenous, who work in the Indigenous science space, looking specifically at those questions of consent as part of all the research that we do. And as for TCPS2, to be honest with you, I think there needs to be an entire chapter specifically about new and emerging data types, because I think, it's not necessarily enough to try and fit social media into the existing standards that exist, but we actually have to think about and make very concerted efforts about what it looks like to engage with social media from the perspective of research. And the benefit of doing that is that when we talk about standardization, TCPS2 is a very good approach to it, but your makeup of each individual research ethics committee is going to vary wildly. University research ethics committees, I've disagreed with some of their decisions when it comes to the Indigenous involvement there. So I mean, having ways in which we can standardize that, I think, would be really helpful. It shouldn't be put into something else. It really should be its own kind of living entity.
Thanks, Sam. Any other comments? All right. So how about a broader question? And I will say for those in the audience, feel free to put your questions in as well. But is there a danger here that, too strict an approach to research ethics in relation to social media data may disadvantage academic researchers, who are, of course, subject to research ethics and institutional policies, while failing to constrain harms from certain types of commercial research? And how could this be addressed?
Yes, and question mark. No, I mean, I think, I think there's, I mean, from some, I'm have a very particular perspective. From a private perspective, it's a whole lot easier to use data once you like. The hard part is getting data. Using data for additional purposes tends to be easier under privacy law than getting hold of the data in the first place. So yeah, I certainly think there is a potential that laws have been written and will be written in the future that privilege commercial use of data over academic or other research data. I think that's a very real issue. As to the why, and this partly it speaks to, like, the questions in the Q&A about positive opportunities in the space. I do actually think that the positive opportunity is there is a lot of thought going in right now in the regulatory space and in the legislative space to how we can enable the use of data for socially beneficial purposes. It's kind of weakly done. I shouldn't say that. It's done in C27, and I would argue it's fairly weakly done in C27. But it's a topic of conversation. There's a lot of discussion about how you would create a framework that actually allows for specifically socially beneficial use of data, which would presumably largely include academic data. So I would kind of say I don't think we have the answer yet about what that framework would look like or how we get there, but I think there's a lot of interesting opportunity to, like, if folks have ideas about what a structure might look like, there's going to be a lot of openness over the next couple of years in the legislative and regulatory branches to say, okay, how do we do that? We know what we're trying to do. How do we do it?
Go ahead.
I have one idea, but which is I agree with that. I think that it's a real risk, and I think the risk is amplified when safeguards are procedural. So when safeguards are about following very specific steps, it ends up being that researchers tend to follow those steps and try to take them responsibly, and then large and powerful corporate actors are able to manipulate those steps to go around the safeguards and then make profit and exert harm anyway. And that's a real problem. So one way to reduce that asymmetry, even though we will never be able to completely eliminate, is through the efforts of risk minimization and harm minimization. Because when you have an approach like that, then researchers are able to take it responsibly, and then you have a privacy commissioner or a provincial privacy and information commissioner or a court that is able to say, oh, look, in this case, you filled all the procedural safeguards, but you didn't comply with this principle of privacy by design, or you didn't comply with this principle of data minimization because you collected much more data than you needed for your purpose, and it was harmful. And those kind of what we lawyers call ex post mechanisms, so the ones that happen after the fact and are not specified before the fact, give us some flexibility to constrain the difference in power and manipulation that some entities have and some entities don't have to go around these safety measures that we try to set up.
Thank you very much.
I wanted to comment that, not having access to social media data would be a risk for reducing the potential solutions to academic research. And but it's very important what the purpose of the research, and think before you study what ethics principles and so on. I also wondered how companies could be kept in check, because they want to make profit, and one company I work with in England, they had to go through GDPR approval, and they had to explain what their AI algorithm are doing, how they don't keep any private data, how the algorithm works, how is it trained. So that a little bit of giving a little bit more trust to the users of that technology, that there is no, that's more clear what the technology is doing and what not, that the risk of using that particular technology is less if there is some sort of accountability for companies in some way.
And that's where I kind of like, what Ignacio has been talking about, is moving towards this risk-based frameworks or accountability type frameworks, trying to get away from this idea that the only question is whether you have consent. So again, because consent is such a poor mechanism, and it tends to just be a click box thing of, I agree to research by this company. We kind of have like, by forcing that, rewriting a legislation or rethinking legislation to require that level of accountability or disclosure or proactive review by a research ethics board or even a privacy commissioner or whatever. Like finding a way to shift away from the only thing that matters is whether or not somebody has kind of said, yes, you're allowed to do this. Is going to be would be a huge protective step.
Yeah, I completely agree with pretty much everything that's been said here. And I mean, like, the beauty of doing a risk assessment framework is that, like, it's something that could be utilized for new and emerging types of data sets as well, right? Like, we're only talking about social media data right now, but, we don't know what the data sets of the future are going to look like. But if we have a model in place to understand, like, what does risk look like what kind of potential harms can be caused, and, like, use that as a measure of metric, then, we can be a lot more proactive when it comes to future data sets that come out. I think it's not just about the immediate, but we certainly have to think about the future in terms of, how do we make our ethics assessments a lot more practical for folks who are engaging in these types of spaces. And, that being said, like, there is, something to be said about, the fact that, like, private industry research in this area isn't necessarily regulated to the same degree. That could be deeply problematic. And, like, whether or not that's something we kind of want to let slide as sort of like institutions or as a public in general is something I think we need to be quite curious about. Like, it's a little bit unusual that the sort of rigors of ethics that we use for public institutions is not necessarily the same, and that could be an entire conversation on itself.
So we're very close to time. We do have a question from the audience. I am allotting 1 minute to answer it. So and I think it's a good way to finish off. What are some of the positive opportunities that you see in the coming years related to this space? So
I think that's why we do research, to find some way to help people. And one possible way I've seen people looking at how some communities need extra support or extra help, like Francophone communities, maybe they don't have enough medical support, or so that the public health agencies know how to better split the resources for this community, for this kind of issues and so on. So this will be one understanding where the needs is and where how resources could be allocated better. Or I can think of several outcomes, but that's the point of research in general on social media, to answer questions that could help towards something positive, hopefully.
thank you. Anyone else? For 30 seconds before go ahead.
I'll go really quick. I think one very positive development is more sophisticated notions of biases that exist now, particularly in the machine learning community, that we didn't have before, that allow us to understand better how to prevent biases and how to deal with them when they appear.
Great. Thank you very much. And thank you to everyone, our brilliant panelists and our engaged audience. I've been asked to please remind everybody to stay tuned for future CSPC events. The recording of this will be available on their webpage at some point soon, I guess. Please do complete the poll that was just launched if you haven't already. Thank you very much, all of our panelists, and I really appreciate your indulgence in these questions today, and I hope that we can collectively keep this conversation going in the future. So I think at this point, I'm to refer you to the chat line where you'll find some information about some upcoming conferences. And I will thank everyone and wish you a wonderful afternoon. Take care all. Bye-bye.
Bye all.